Welcome to the Ecomodernist channel live. I'm Carl Pauls. I'm here with Chris Bergen and our special returning guest, Daniel Chen.
Hello.
Daniel's a PhD student at Ontario Tech. Sorry for the correction. We get that fixed in the YouTube description. He is instructing students on nuclear engineering. He has brought us a wealth of information and discussion around the topic of nuclear fuel, nuclear non-proliferation, and last time we sort of started off this discussion on heresy, and heresy is engineering that does not match the principles. Is that more or less correct?
Yeah.
And what is it about nuclear fuel security that could possibly be heretical? What could be wrong? I mean, like, we've got the NRC, we've got the IAEA. Everything is, like, really, really well controlled. What could go wrong?
Everything is well controlled, and one can argue too well controlled. So, I guess a bit of context before we start. In addition to, instructing students, I am a student myself. And so this is one of the class presentations that I was asked to do on nuclear security. And my class was reasonably amused. I hope all the listeners are going to be amused about this as well. So we're going to talk about nuclear fuel security. So let's sort of talk about the status of nuclear energy deployment. And I think that this is relevant in part because of some of the feedback I think I got from last week, 2 weeks ago, I should say. And I found that a lot of people have either overly optimistic or overly pessimistic ideas about where nuclear is in the world at the moment. So this is how much primary energy is being used around the world. As you can see, sort of nuclear occupies about 10% of the current global energy mix, right? So it's kind of 3.4 Rontgens, I guess. Not great, not terrible. It's primary electricity. So nuclear is 10% of global electricity generation, about 5%-ish of world total primary energy use. And so the distribution of nuclear energy is shown in this chart. You'll notice that most of nuclear energy is in North America and Europe. Asia is growing with Asia growing quickly, although perhaps not quite as quickly as some people might like. And despite everything said about Africa, Africa isn't quite there yet. Here's hoping that they will be. Right. This is the kinds of nuclear energy reactor technology, I should say, that is used. Despite the excitement about advanced reactors, they are in fact not common. They are actually pretty niche, so somewhere here at the bottom of the graph. Meanwhile, overwhelmingly, the industry is dominated by pressurized water reactor types. And with boiling water reactors coming in at a distant second, and the CANDU type reactors, the pressurized heavy water types, at a very, very distant third. And one of the things that's note about all this is that, with the exception of the heavy water type reactors, all of the reactors do require enriched fuel. So, status of nuclear energy, just to summarize what we just went through, a modest fraction, modest, I guess, carrying a lot of weight here, a modest fraction of the world energy is generated with nuclear. Most of that is in Europe and North America, Asia catching up. Overwhelming majority of reactors dependent on enriched uranium, right? So that's sort of the past of nuclear. What about the future of nuclear energy deployment, right? Well, if the news and the press releases are to be believed, we have SMRs, 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 right? So And here are sort of the selected advanced reactor developers, I guess. And this is actually a pretty wide portfolio of different reactor types. We have sodium-cooled reactors, we have molten salt reactors, we have light water reactors. No heavier water reactors here, I don't think, although we do have graphite moderated reactors in here, I believe. But sort of regardless of the fact that the reactor types are very diverse, the fuel needs are pretty much the same. HALEU, 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 HALEU. So the future of nuclear energy development, again, even the press is to believe, is small modular reactors, right? And most of those small modular reactors require high assay, low enriched uranium. Now, just to say that these sets of slides are made 2 years ago, some of this might be a bit dated. And as of right now, the reactor types that people are talking about don't use high assay, low enriched uranium anymore for reasons that we're going to explain. Right? So now that we've gone through the types of reactors that we currently use and the types of reactors that we're going to use, where does all this fuel come from? Right. So here is the world's enrichment capacity. And remember that nearly all reactors currently in use do require enriched uranium, right? And you'll notice that in the column 2020, half of the world's enrichment is done by a guy called Rosatom, right? Which is the Russian atomic energy company, right? And then, surely you think that, oh, maybe this isn't great, but maybe it'd get better in the future. Well, in the future, it is not, because, by 2030, half of the rest would be coming from China Nuclear Corps in China, right? And this is a problem because Russia is committing genocide. The future is going to be a problem because China is committing genocide. There's genocide happening all over the place. America's new nuclear power industry has a Russian problem, right? HALEU is enriched uranium that is more enriched than the uranium that we currently have. As a result, very, very few people know how to make it. And in fact, as of right now, only Russia knows how to make it. And you ask Bill Gates, they're going to tell you that we didn't have a fuel problem until a few months ago. This said in 2020, so I guess they didn't have a fuel problem until 2 years ago now, right? So, you get very authoritative people and organizations like the IAEA, right? And they say that amid the global crisis, nuclear power provides energy security, right? And of course, that's bullshit, right? Nuclear power does not, in fact, provide energy security, because the reality that we live in right now is that right now, half of our fuel comes from a warmongering genocidal regime, right? And in the future, it's going to be worse, right? It's going to come from 2 warmongering genocidal regimes, right? And all of this is carried out with the blessings of a corrupt international regulator. Where does the security from this all come from, right? So now that we've established the dire situation we're in, why? Why are we where we are right now, right? And so here is a wall of text from the World Nuclear Association, and it's a bit long. If you're not anyone watching the recording might want to pause to read it, but for the benefit of the people actually watching the stream, right? I've circled the important points in red, right? You had a US-led global nuclear energy partnership, right? That had this multilateral approach to non-proliferation, which established in 2007 an international enrichment center in Siberia, in Russia, right? So this is so stupid that I need to say this in plain English, as I established last week. Nuclear engineers do not, in fact, speak English. We talk in Newspeak, right? So what the US is saying is that as part of a multilateral approach to non-proliferation, we are going to concentrate all of our enrichment in big nuclear weapon states, right? And in fact, not just big nuclear weapon states, we're concentrating them in one nuclear weapon state, right? And what do you mean? This is not international gaslighting at all, right? Multilateral means that you're concentrating everything in the hands of one big person. What are you telling are you talking about, right? And, 2007 is in the Obama era, but in fact, it is not entirely Obama's fault, I suppose. As far back as George Bush, George Bush famously said that enrichment and reprocessing are not necessary for nations seeking to harness nuclear energy for peaceful purposes, which is to say that making fuel is bad and evil, and we should discourage everybody from doing it, right? And, everybody loves it when the US tells you what you can and cannot do. South Korea, in particular, learned this very, very fancy German word to describe what they view as, right and just, and, everything is hunky-dory with the United States, right? And so what can possibly go wrong when you concentrate all of your fuel supplies in one singular genocidal regime, right? So in conclusion, right, to secure global fuel security, what we need to do is abolish the nuclear Gestapo, right? We need to abolish the hypocritical multilateral non-proliferation bullshit, and we need to abolish the corrupt international regulator that's enforcing and enabling them. And most importantly, we need to allow all countries to make their own darn fuel so that we don't need to rely on genocidal maniacs with nukes. And so before either Carl or anyone in the audience asks, yes, all countries does in fact include Iran. And that's all I have for today. And I'm going to try and invite discussions, shall we say.
Oh boy, that's that's a tall order. But I know that there's a lot of different things to go in here. Number one, this is our own personal opinion, and I gotta like make that extra clear is that I have like a long history of nuclear advocacy and does not represent the people I work for right now. I'm not against this. I think that the best features of nuclear energy is that every country, and literally I mean every country, has access to seawater, which means every country has access in some way to uranium. You can get uranium from seawater. It's a little more expensive than digging it out of the dirt in Kazakhstan or Canada or Australia, but eventually this is the leveling of the playing field, is that literally everyone can access this technology. No matter your military might, you could produce, you could enrich, and then it would be up to the same mechanisms we have today to prevent the abuse of that technology. We have great big secret monitoring programs to look out for places like Iran enriching too much, and this is the other part of the Gestapo tactics. But even if that were just, even if we pretend that okay, that's fine, we absolutely have to stop people from going over 25-30% enrichment, it's still possible. It's still able, we can still monitor these things. We can still use the IAEA mechanisms to look for diversionary pathways. And so even if I'm not 100% on your anti-weapons Gestapo take, I can still sign on to this freedom of basic enrichment idea. And it's not so crazy. It's not so crazy to say that all countries should be able to make their own darn fuel. It's the vision for the future. Go ahead.
I mean, you would think that, but, as of right now, the United States has a law called Section 123 of the U.S. Atomic Energy Act, which says that, if you buy U.S. reactors, then you forfeit the decision to either enrich nuclear fuel or reprocess nuclear waste, right? And so what is the message that is trying to be sent here? Is it that you should be buying Russian?
Maybe Korean, maybe UAE has it right, and they chose the middle path so that they could start without enriching, And then if the US decides to flex their Gestapo muscle, the UAE would be able to find a secondary source. KEPCO, is that a partnership with any US supplier, or is that only South Korean supplied?
Of course it is. Like one of the biggest controversies in nuclear last year, I would say, is that Westinghouse sued KEPCO because over the fact that their APRs, so Westinghouse claims, is a knockoff of AP technologies. It isn't as though South Korea hasn't been complaining about the fact that they don't get to make fuel, right, for a really, really long time. Of course, this is all secured. And then just the rather ironic example that you brought up with the UAE. The UAE literally invented something called the gold standard, right? So under current U.S. law, countries that buy U.S. reactors are required to say that if we want to enrich and or reprocess, we will have to ask U.S. Congress for permission. U.S. Congress usually says no, unless that country already has enrichment and reprocessing tech, right? What the UAE said was that we're going to sweeten the deal. Not only will we have to ask your permission, we actually won't, right? We are going to just pinky swear that we aren't ever going to enrich or reprocess our own fuel, ever. That's an even sort of stricter set of restrictions. And, the Obama administration heard this and said, that is a great idea. I wonder who else we can convince to implement these things. And, well, nobody else particularly wanted the US breathing down their necks when they want their own fuel supply. And the only country that was able to be coerced into complying is, unfortunately, Taiwan. And so Taiwan signed a gold standard agreement with the US in 2014. Shortly thereafter, a bunch of anti-nuclear people decided to shut down nuclear plants in Taiwan.
So is this agreement pushing countries to give up on their nuclear ambitions?
Yes.
It is. Wow.
Yes. It has been part of US policy for a very, very long time now. Within this slide, it goes back to the Bush era. It actually goes back much further than that. By the way, this essay by Stephen E. Miller, I would highly recommend to anyone who has time to read it. It sort of documents US thinking into the whole non-proliferation and nuclear fuel cycle, right? And one of the things I really liked about this essay was just how honest it was, right? So the orthodoxy within nuclear non-proliferation is that there is a thing called the Treaty for the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, right? And it has 8 articles, but it is commonly thought that there are 3 pillars in quotation marks with the non-proliferation treaty, right? First one is called is non-proliferation, right? What that means is that countries that do not have nuclear weapons are not supposed to get nuclear weapons, right? Second one is disarmament, which means that countries that are supposed to have nuclear weapons are supposed to get rid of them. And then the third pillar is peaceful uses of atomic energy, which basically says that if you're not making atomic weapons, then you get to use atomic energy however the hell you want. This is the non-proliferation orthodoxy for a very long time, except within the US foreign policy circles, the US foreign policy circle decides that, of those 3 pillars, only one is actually important, and that is non-proliferation. Disarmament, we don't want to disarm. Peaceful uses, who cares about those brown people? And so in practice, what non-proliferation has always been is just non-proliferation, non-proliferation, non-proliferation. In fact, there is a US law called the US Non-Proliferation Act of 1978. Within the second paragraph, it literally tells you that it is US policy to discourage all countries from using energy sources that are either petroleum-based or nuclear. And in fact, the US is going to spend effort dissuading developing countries from using either fossil fuels or nuclear, and that they are going to encourage exclusively solar and wind in developing countries. Just so you know, like, there is a common idea, especially within nuclear advocacy, that the pure renewables idea comes from Greenpeace. No, it doesn't. It comes from the United States. It comes from US foreign policy.
That completely explains why Russia and China are winning in building up the infrastructure in Africa. And it is unbelievable that we are not like meeting those countries, those powers, with our own soft power initiatives. I mean, we have some interest, especially from Europe, in sort of taking all that great desert land and turning it into a big solar array. But this is not developing Africa's infrastructure as much as renting their land to generate solar power. It's not building up their consumer base. It's not an economic development. It's a land leasing plan. And so China is building ports. Russia is building ports and reactors. What what are we doing?
So one of my contacts, I suppose, is a guy called Seaver Wong. And Seaver is a researcher for Breakthrough Institute, based in California, I believe. He often talks about sort of the exploitative nature of both Chinese energy industry, essentially Uyghur slave labor, right, to make solar panels and also mine coal, but also externally, right? You know, there are a lot of people in African countries, and sometimes the African country governments themselves, that are very pissed at China due to how the Belt and Road Initiative is turning out, right? Because basically what it amounts to is that you have a bunch of, Chinese laborers working for Chinese businesses to build infrastructure that is going to be owned and run by China to a great extent, to further, Chinese businesses exploiting the resources in those African countries, right? And China is still the more well-known one. I'm surprised to learn quite recently from actually one of my lab mates, right, from Bangladesh, and she said that the Bangladesh nuclear program is a lot like that as well, right? You have Bangladesh basically buying Russian reactors that are designed by Russian engineers, built by Russian builders, right, and then operated by Russians under Russian regulations, right? And there is supposed to be oversight from the Bangladeshi nuclear energy program, except that based on stuff that she's been seeing, apparently a lot of those guys don't actually know what the hell that they're talking about, right? And so all of this is coming to a reckoning, right? And going back to Seaver, he acknowledges and talks about a lot about all of these things in detail, right? But then at the end of the day, he would say, all the same, right? At the end of the day, whatever other misgivings either you or those countries in Africa and Asia have about Chinese concrete, it is concrete that exists that can be used to build infrastructure, which is better than American concrete, because American concrete doesn't exist. There was a guy who put this sort of very succinctly, right? He said that he went to, I think it was Kenya, don't quote me on this, right? And asked them sort of what do they feel about sort of foreign aid coming from China versus the US. And they said that it is simple, right? When the Chinese come, they build us an airport. When the US comes, they give us endless lectures. So
Yeah.
yeah.
And remind me, who's helping build the big hydro project in Ethiopia, right next to Kenya?
Yeah, China, I believe. In the West, when faced with a world-ending flood, Noah built a boat, right? In China, when faced with a world-ending flood, Xiaoyu built a wall to keep the water reactor out. So,
and there it is. I found it. It is
yeah.
$1 billion for
Mhm.
the equipment came from the Exim Bank of China.
I think that it is good that America and other Western countries are approaching foreign aid, if you call it that, and foreign investments with a certain amount of caution, right? Because it can be done exploitatively, right? China has been doing it exploitatively, but at the same time, it's like, there's also been. I also think that the West has been cowed into a corner, and I think that most of this has a lot to do with the fact that, for all the talk about Western values, as of right now, the West doesn't have a value. It doesn't even have ideologies or even a plan. As exemplified by, George Bush saying that enrichment and reprocessing are not necessary for nations seeking to harness nuclear energy for peaceful purposes.
Just
Right?
just just buy it. Just fill up out of the tank of the United States. Oops, I mean Russia, because we gave up all of the enrichment. Joe Biden's administration has built up new enrichment capacity, and so we've got hundreds of millions to billions of dollars invested in U.S. producing HALEU, and this is great news. But so I think to your point is that's not a sustainable plan for the world.
Let's go back to this page, right? Where is the US on this chart?
Oh, it's not even it's other? Is that it?
Yeah, it is other. It's a very small part of other. You can double the others if you want. And in fact, this chart is being optimistic in thinking that it increases tenfold. It doesn't matter. The nuclear advocacy likes talking about how renewable energy only advocates don't understand scale. And that is very true, right? The problem is that nuclear advocacy a lot of the times don't understand scales either, right?
Right. And that is a problem. If we criticize that, for example, Washington State has not built new wind capacity in a decade, it is only fair to criticize the lack of enrichment, permitting, construction. It's like these momentums matter. And so, like, when I say we should be building gigawatts per month of renewables and nuclear, that cuts both ways. We're failing at permitting new wind and solar sites. We're failing at permitting new nuclear sites and new enrichment. We have to do it all, really.
I mean, it's not just that you need to do it all. It's that you need to allow others to do it all as well. Right?
Right.
Yeah. Because it's like, let's go back even further to this. People love talking about the inadequacies of solar and wind and other renewable energy sources, right? And to me, anyway, that's very true, right? From a technological perspective, to be honest to myself, I regard wind and solar as useless distractions. I'm sorry if that upsets anybody in the audience, right? Nuclear is where it's at. But at the same time, nuclear really isn't there. It is 10% of total electricity generation, 5% of total primary energy use. The industry and advocacy is sort of cheerleading for the fact that we're going to be building, I don't know, maybe 10 reactors over the next decade, right? And this is going to decarbonize the grid somehow, right? And do you have any idea how fast you need to build nuclear reactors to decarbonize the grid by, let's go with the UN plan, 2060? 12 to 18 gigawatts a month. To put it in ways that the average layperson can understand, what this means is that somewhere in the world, a nuclear reactor needs to pop into existence every other day for the next 40 years.
Right. Even if we only did 25%, that's still one a week.
Yes. And just to sort of illustrate what I was saying earlier about the fact that I view solar and wind as being pointless distractions, right? Let's say you don't like nuclear, right? For every nuclear plant that you aren't going to build from that previous total, right, you're going to have to build 1,000 wind turbines or 1,000,000 houses with solar panels on the roof, right?
Yeah.
You know,
I would say, it's at least 5 to 10 times the capacity in variable renewables
yeah,
to accompany the nuclear. And
exactly.
that's the best case, that where we actually
That
make decarbonization progress. And we
no,
are not doing
that
that.
is actually
Go ahead.
no, that is actually the worst case. It
Okay.
is the worst case because it assumes that by 2060, right, world primary energy use stays as it is right now.
Okay, so my case is like I usually account for that, and so I'm being when I say 10 to 20 or 20 to 40
Yeah.
gigawatts of variable renewables a month, that is with a
Mhm.
doubling to tripling of demand in that time. But go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, I'm just going to interject that a lot of these projections are thinking about no increase or minimal increase of, say, the data centers with the AI running in them.
Right.
Recent article, I think, said 0.3
Oh,
watt hours for every Google search, and as an average, and it's something like 2.9 watt hours for every AI chat GPT inquiry. So 0.3 and 2.9, that's a huge difference that AI kicks in. And we're just getting started on that roller coaster. So we probably need to minimally double electricity use in the United States, possibly triple, if we're going to increase public transportation. Then if portions of that would be electrified,
Right.
it boggles the mind.
Yeah,
possibly.
if global demand, just bringing everyone up to a modest
Mm-hmm.
style of living, an urban China style of living, is a
Right.
tripling in energy demand, then adding AI on top of that, that's another 50%. So a 250% increase at least in global energy demand.
Well, yeah.
Minimally,
I
yeah.
mean, if I'm going to be completely honest, I'm praying that that doesn't actually happen. We're looking towards a more energy intense future, or at least we should be hoping that it is, right? Because there are people living really, really abjectly horrible lives right now due to
Mhm.
lack
Yeah.
of energy, amongst other reasons. One of the more important energy sources, and by my standards, the most important energy source to us getting there, is being effectively shadow banned by the US government and by the IEA. And that's just not acceptable. Something that I alluded to 2 weeks earlier, but I don't think I made that very clear, right? But sort of the reason why there is so much technology heresy within the nuclear space is because nuclear engineers are required to use newspeak, right? We're required to have told two conflicting ideas in our heads, right? We are required to double think, right? There are thought crimes in nuclear engineering. I use these sort of very Orwellian words quite deliberately, in my opinion. It's like the nuclear engineering field is not as free as other courses are. And a big part of that is that the people who are supposed to be in support of nuclear actually support nuclear because they want nuclear to continue being very Orwellian in nature.
I can't disagree. There are hundreds of workers at the Hanford cleanup site in Washington, and not to downplay the seriousness of that, but it makes you wonder what the end goal of this project is when you talk to some of the people who are responsible for that cleanup effort when it is not necessarily driving towards a cleanup solution. Now, it's of course different, and I love our nuclear startup companies who actually seem to be focused on at least producing a product. But that's a pretty low bar. That is a low bar to say that, oh, I'm glad you're focused on producing a product. Go ahead, Chris.
I agree. All countries should have access to nuclear fuels, as well as the basic civilian nuclear technologies to create energy. But nuclear can be very expensive to start out at. And then as you amortize over several decades, it becomes among the cheaper ones, or at least affordable. But it doesn't make sense in my mind to have every country mining, every country purifying into yellow cake, every country enriching. It's where do you think a good balance would be? 20 or 25 countries that would make the fuel and distribute, or
So
we need to keep it affordable for those smaller countries as well. So I'm driving at.
of course you do. And in terms of politics, I consider myself a pretty left-leaning person. All the same, right, with that preface, right, if you want stuff to be cheap, right, there's this thing called free market that's supposed to deal with that, right? And it introduces a bunch of other problems as well, right? Which is why you shouldn't apply it willy-nilly, right? But if you want things to be cheap, then what you should do is allow everybody to do it, right? And not everybody will. I highly doubt, for example, that Nepal is going to be doing a whole lot of enrichment and reprocessing. Although, you know, if Nepal wants to do that and they somehow manage to make it work, then that's fine, right? But, you know, it needs to be a lot more than the handful that we have right now, right? Because right now, the handful that we have is Russia, it's Urenco. You know, no one really knows how that works, even Urenco itself, it would seem, right? And it's China, and that's it. The problem just sort of being, or perhaps not as cheap as it could be. This also sort of fuels a big sense of insecurity, I think, right? One of the big problems that I perceive the industry to be undergoing right now is the fact that the US wants to have a lot of nuclear reactors, right? The US also wants to do enrichment, but, you know, they want to do enrichment within the US and do it more cheaply than Russia, right? But then they have a conundrum, right? Because no one wants to buy reactors that for which fuel doesn't exist, right? At the same time, nobody wants to make fuel that there aren't reactors that are going to use, right? So it's a chicken and egg problem, right? And right now, what it seems to me to be happening is that the US is trying to solve this problem supply side first, right? So it is encouraging the tripling of global nuclear deployment, which is good, I guess. But, you know, at the end of the day, I think that this is very wrong-headed if what you want is cheap fuel. If you want cheap fuel, right, then you need to solve this thing's demand supply side first, right? By having a lot of people mining, a lot of people enriching, right?
Yeah. Well, cheap fuel, we use so little fuel in nuclear, I don't care if it's cheap. Moderately priced fuel, I would be fine with for reactors. But as a follow-up,
yeah. But sort of going back to, I think I want to sort of explain a concept with that, which I think a lot of nuclear advocacy gets backwards, right? So they say that the overwhelmingly the cost of nuclear energy comes from the plant and not the fuel or either other types of running costs, labor costs, for an instance, right? And so they say, therefore, it doesn't matter if the fuel isn't cheap, right? Or that it doesn't matter if the fuel source isn't diverse. And I would argue that no, it is the complete opposite, right? Nuclear is extremely capital intensive. So bearing this in mind, let's suppose you have Vietnam, for an instance, right? A country that isn't rich, but is well-to-do enough that it can start its own nuclear fleet, should it choose to. So you have Vietnam, right? Are they willing to spend tens of billions of dollars building a nuclear plant, right? Knowing that they are only going to make this money back if that nuclear plant is going to be running for the next 40 years, but they aren't going to be certain if they can source fuel for it, right? Mm-hmm. Because if not, then, why go with nuclear?
So I'm scheduled to have a debate about new nuclear with a fellow, and his break even is a third, let's say about a third of what the current construction cost is. If we drive that cost per kilowatt down to a third of what it is today, then fuel price is going to start to matter. If we drive down labor cost, fuel price will matter. This is not the number one problem today. We want it to be the number one problem soon. If we're succeeding as an industry, we want fuel price to be an issue.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. But the thing is that even within the narrow scope of fuel, right, price is the least of anybody's worries, right? As I mentioned, right now, substantially most of the fuel that we're using comes from a genocidal regime. Within 10 years' time, 3/4 of that is going to be coming from a total of 2 genocidal regimes.
Let's go Canada.
And of
Canada,
course,
you can save us, right?
Yeah.
Oh, if you want, we can do Heresy Part 3, where I talk about the prospects of enrichment in Canada. Canada does 1/3 of what's known as chemical conversion. So what that means is that when you dig uranium out of the ground, it's in oxide form. It's kind of like the stuff that your ceramic teacups are made of, right? And what chemical conversion does is that it transforms that oxide into a fluoride. So it becomes something which is kind of like table salt in the sense that it dissolves in water and, you need to keep it dry and all that, right? And then it also does deconversion, which is kind of the opposite thing, which is where you turn the fluoride salts back into oxide, because that's what you use in your fuel, right? And maybe you or some of your audience are going to be very confused right now, right? Why do we do this thing where we dig stuff out of the ground, turn it into a salt, and then just only to turn it back again, right? And the reason is that, you need to do enrichment. And as of right now, the only chemical form that allows for enrichment is the fluoride salts, right? And so Canada essentially does chemical conversion, which is this sort of prelude to a process that Canada itself, first of all, doesn't do, and secondly, doesn't even benefit from, because Canada is one of the few countries that do not, in fact, use enriched fuel, right? And it's like one of the enduring jokes that I have heard in Canada after coming here is that Canada's biggest export is brains to the US, right? Canada trains a bunch of highly educated people in universities, and then instead of seeking out employment in Canada, they move south, right?
Yeah.
And it's the same thing with uranium as well, right? Canada does 1/3 of the world's chemical conversion for reasons that basically does not benefit Canada itself. And it's ridiculous, right? So much of that value could be retained in Canada if Canada is allowed to enrich, and Canada isn't. So, ways to screw over your neighbors there, I suppose.
Yeah. Go ahead, Chris, you had a question.
Yeah, got another thought. So it's let's say that we do get an increase in the number of people making fuel, and we build more reactors. Say we move up to, say, 20 countries that are making fuel, and maybe another 10 countries that combined go under the other categories. We have a nice variety. Are you in favor of there being a regulator to follow up and see how much they're enriching it and see what they're doing with the tailings? Would you like to see the IAEA with a facelift considering that role, or what are some of your thoughts? Do you feel 20%? Should all countries be allowed to enrich 20%? And anything over 20 then is a red flag?
So that is a very good and very complicated question, I suppose. I'm going to attempt to answer this question by answering it backwards. To your last question, like, do we accept that there is a line and, beyond that line, something is acceptable? No, I fundamentally do not believe that. And if I'm allowed to, I shall show you guys
Go ahead.
the actual text of the Treaty of Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, specifically Article 5. Potential benefits to peaceful applications of nuclear explosions will be made available to non-nuclear weapon states party to the treaty on a non-discriminatory basis. Right? What this means is that the people who formulated the NPT in the kinds of nuclear activities that it considers unacceptable, literal nuclear bombs are not nuclear weapons unless they are used to kill people.
Right.
Or with the intent of killing people, right? Peaceful application of nuclear explosions is a concept that exists to these people, right? And if nuclear explosives are to be acceptable, then I don't see any reason why we should be restricting enrichment to any level of enrichment. I'm going to say up front that this view is controversial, I know, but it is the view that I honestly hold. Sort of going back to an earlier part of your question, correct me if I'm wrong, but it was sort of about how, it was sort of about whether or not, there should be, inspections by international regulators, specifically the IAEA.
So today, the IAEA is just someone who checks your reports and might audit you. But we're talking about transitioning to a enforcement agency. And that's different.
So, in principle, I would agree. In practice, no. Right? Because enforcement goes both ways, right? In fact, it doesn't just go both ways, it goes three ways because the non-proliferation supposedly has three pillars, right? So in addition to the IAEA being allowed into non-nuclear weapon states and saying that, hey, you're doing stuff that I suspect is building a nuclear weapon, and not just a nuclear bomb, a nuclear weapon, right? Please stop what it is that you're doing, right? Or else, essentially, right? In addition to that, the IAEA should be allowed to go to the US and China and Russia and tell them, these nukes, get rid of them now. Disarm, right? Disarmament is also part of the NPT, by the way.
Yes.
It's not as strictly enforced, but it is there, right? The IAEA should be allowed to do that, right? The IAEA should also be allowed to go to the US, go to the US Congress and say that Section 123 of the US Atomic Energy Act violates the peaceful use clause, right? Get rid of it now, or else. If it's that kind of enforcement, I am in principle in agreement with that. Countries that don't have nuclear weapons don't get them. Countries that do have nuclear weapons need to get rid of them. And no country is allowed to interfere with peaceful uses of atomic energy by any other country, right? The IAEA needs to enforce that, right? So to sort of go back to the more realistic answer I have to the question, in practice, hell no, right? The IAEA had proven themselves time and time again to be ineffectual in stopping nuclear weapons, but what they have been effective with is stopping countries from getting peaceful uses of atomic energy. Actually, the instructor for the course that this slide comes from, Dr. Ed Waller, right? Nearing the beginning of the Ukraine war, remember that the IAEA sent people to Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, right? And he basically said that it's great that the IAEA sent 7 hostages to Russia, right? I mean, why else are they there? Zaporizhzhia is a plant that the IAEA, for the most part, doesn't really understand. And, on the off chance that Russia does anything weird there, all those 7 guys are going to be able to do anything about it? No. The IAEA is, by design, toothless against the nuclear weapon states And by the nuclear weapon states, I mean the P5, right?
Mm. Well,
and it is allowed to maul everybody else, including Taiwan, which isn't even part of the IAEA. I am not allowed to enter IAEA premises on a Taiwanese passport.
Right. And
to hell with that.
And let's be a little more honest. It is the IAEA is not an enforcer. It's the US and Israeli security forces are the only folks who have done enforcement recently against Iran.
If you call it that.
It is, state actors are the enforcement, and the IAEA is this minder, basically, who is supposed to tell the rest of the class when all of the football players get in a fight who's the right and who's in the wrong.
Well, while I'm on my, I should say, IAEA bashing spree, there is no anti-nuclear organization more competent than the IAEA. And you can tell that from its logo, right?
Yeah. Well,
it doesn't have the atomic nucleus in it. Literally, it is aesthetically anti-nuclear.
At least the IAEA is not a hostile regulator. They have a nominal interest in promoting the use of nuclear technology, even if we need a whole other international organization for explicitly promoting the use of nuclear energy. It's better than the US, which would be like if we had an FAA-style version of the NRC, we would be exporting reactors tomorrow. Because it would be run by the people who have an interest in exporting reactors. That's just my opinion. Do you have any other thoughts before we imagine what could be in part 3? Just summarize your views on part 2.
Summarize my views on part 2. I mean, part 2 hasn't been anything that I haven't been complaining about very often on this show, even, really, right? But it is just that fundamentally, the industry and advocacy needs to come to a reckoning. And that is that to have widespread use of nuclear energy, or in fact, any technology at all, right, is to be okay with the risk that someone might do something with it that you don't particularly like. And that by extension, just like by being absolutely adamant that the thing you do not want to happen doesn't happen, right? The only way to assure that is to not have it done at all. That is the philosophy of Greenpeace. Despite how much I dislike it, I respect it. It makes sense. They don't think that any amount of nuclear is safe. Any amount of weapons proliferation risk is acceptable. Therefore, they're just going to say that, right, nobody gets to use this technology, not even ourselves. This is a horrible philosophy to have, but it is still more consistent than the one that a lot of nuclear advocacy, especially in the US, have right now, right? Which is essentially nukes for me, but not for thee.
Right.
Just sometimes dressed in a particular way. And the industry and advocacy, especially in the US, needs to have a reckoning with that, right? And, if at the end of the day, you still think that nuclear energy is worth the risk of brown people getting nukes, if I'm allowed to be crude, then there needs to be more complaining about US export policy, especially fuel cycle restrictions. There needs to be talks about abolishing Section 123 of the US Atomic Energy Act. There needs to be admission that US thinking with regards to non-proliferation is fundamentally flawed. There are well-meaning people who say that, we want other countries to have the full benefits of nuclear energy. That's why we are hard at work inventing stuff like neutrino spectrum analysis or other things to do safeguards. No, right? The world cannot wait for you to invent these kinds of magic tech that may or may not exist, right, before it starts using nuclear energy, right?
This has been the Ecomodernist channel live. You can catch us every Sunday at 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern, right here on Twitch, on twitter.com/CarlAlexPauls, x.com/CarlAlexPauls. You can find us at soyaddle.tv or twitch.tv/soyaddle. You can find us on YouTube at the Ecomodernist channel, and you can find us on our website at esna.earth. Please consider supporting us on Patreon. Find us at the Ecomodernist channel. And remember, emissions first, peace and justice will follow.
Please subscribe to us on YouTube, Ecomodernist channel. Also to subscribe to us on Twitter and Facebook, Ecomodernist Society of North America.
And online at https://esna.earth.